Have you ever felt that gnawing sense of unease, that unspoken question that creeps in late at night? What am I doing here? What is the point? It's a feeling that resonates deep within all of us at some point in life, and it's a feeling that stood at the very heart of the philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard. Born in Copenhagen, Denmark, in 1813, Kierkegaard is often called the father of existentialism. Unlike many philosophers before him who built towering abstract systems about the nature of the universe, Kierkegaard turned philosophy inward, focusing not on what the universe is made of, but on what it means to be a human being. He asked questions like, what is existence? What is the purpose of life? Why do we behave the way we do? These weren't empty academic questions for him. They were real struggles, rooted in his own life experience, which makes his philosophy feel alive even today. From an early age, Kierkegaard wrestled with religion, despair, and meaning. He grew up in a strict Christian household with a father who believed that God's curse hung over the family. This environment gave young Kierkegaard a deep, restless awareness of sin, guilt, and faith. At the same time, he was filled with doubt. A famous story tells us that as a boy, while tending sheep in the fields, he saw them hungry, cold, and shivering. Instead of thanking God for creation, he cursed the Lord, asking why such innocent creatures should suffer. This moment captures the tension that defined him, a longing for God mixed with profound doubt about his presence. Kierkegaard's life reflected the same paradoxes that filled his writings. He fell deeply in love with a woman named Regine Olsen, and for a time it seemed he would marry her. But Kierkegaard saw only two socially acceptable paths in front of him, to become a pastor or to marry. Instead, he chose a third path, breaking off his engagement and dedicating himself fully to a life of writing. This decision haunted him for years but also freed him to explore human existence in radical new ways. With a small inheritance, he devoted himself to writing full-time. He began with satirical works mocking the superficiality of society but soon turned to deeper explorations of human life, producing in 1843 alone an astonishing 9 books that probed the possibilities of human existence. Kierkegaard was not interested in philosophy as a distant, intellectual exercise. For him, philosophy was about how we live, how we choose, and how we relate to God. He insisted that life is understood backward but lived forward, meaning that while we can only make sense of our lives looking at the past, we are forced to live by moving into an uncertain future. This tension between understanding and living runs through his philosophy. His central message was that every individual must discover themselves and become a true individual before God, not just a face in the crowd. That's why he was so critical of collectivist ideologies like Marxism and communism, which in his view reduced individuals to a herd. For Kierkegaard, the greatest task in life was not to serve society blindly, but to know oneself and to stand alone before God. Religion, for Kierkegaard, was the highest stage of life, but not the comfortable, easy religion of the state church of Denmark. He fiercely criticized what he called Christendom, the institutional church that allowed people to call themselves Christians without ever truly living as one. In his eyes, Christendom was a religion of laziness and convenience, a distraction between the individual and God. True Christianity, he argued, was a deeply personal transformation that required courage, faith, and authenticity. But what kind of faith was this? Kierkegaard believed that true faith was not about rational proofs or doctrines, it was about embracing the absurd. To believe in God is to believe despite the lack of evidence, to hold on to hope even when reason tells you it is impossible. He illustrated this with the story of the Knight of Infinite Resignation, a man who falls hopelessly in love with a princess. Knowing the love can never be realized, the knight gives her up, accepting the impossibility of their union. Yet, in a leap of absurd faith, he still believes, without logic or reason, that somehow, through God, he will be reunited with her. Even greater than this knight, Kierkegaard tells us, is the knight of faith, one who makes the same sacrifice but simultaneously believes that God will restore what is lost. This paradoxical belief, that with God all things are possible, lies at the heart of faith for Kierkegaard. This paradox becomes most vivid in Kierkegaard's masterpiece, Fear and Trembling, where he retells the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. When God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son, Abraham faces an impossible contradiction. By universal moral law, to kill one's child is murder. Yet by divine command, it is obedience. Kierkegaard calls this the teleological suspension of the ethical, meaning that God's higher purpose can suspend human morality. Abraham cannot explain or justify his act. He must stand alone before God in anguish, willing to give up his son yet believing, against all reason, that God will somehow return Isaac to him. This is the essence of the leap of faith, an embrace of the absurd that defies all logic but defines authentic faith. Kierkegaard didn't just explore faith, though, he also dug deep into the inner struggles of human existence. In The Concept of Anxiety, 1844, he described anxiety as the dizziness of freedom. Unlike fear, which has a specific object, anxiety is a formless dread that arises when we realize we are free to choose, even to choose destruction. He gives the example of standing at the edge of a cliff. Fear is the danger of falling. But anxiety is the dizzy realization that you could choose to jump. This unsettling freedom is terrifying but also necessary, because it awakens us to responsibility and the possibility of becoming our authentic selves. Closely tied to anxiety is Kierkegaard's concept of despair, which he explored in The Sickness Unto Death. For him, despair was not a psychological illness but a spiritual condition, a misrelation of the self. Some live in unconscious despair, absorbed in worldly distractions without realizing they are estranged from their deeper self. Others live in conscious despair, wishing they were someone else or refusing to be themselves. The most defiant form of despair is trying to be oneself apart from God, which for Kierkegaard is ultimately self-destruction, since the self is rooted in the divine. Unlike a physical sickness, despair cannot be ended by death. It is a sickness of the immortal spirit, and the only cure is faith, reconciliation of the self with God. At the center of all this lies Kierkegaard's notion of the absurd. Unlike later existentialists like Camus, who saw the absurd as a conflict between humans and a meaningless universe, Kierkegaard saw it as a paradox that points to the highest form of existence. The absurd is not a wall that ends meaning, it is a doorway that requires the leap of faith. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, the knight's belief in impossible love, these are examples of faith that transcends reason. For Kierkegaard, this is where authentic existence is found. Finally, Kierkegaard made an important distinction between objective and subjective truth. Objective truths, like mathematics, science, or history, are universal, detached, and valid for everyone. But subjective truth is personal, inward, and existential. It is the truth you commit to with passion, the truth that defines your very being. For Kierkegaard, the most important truths of human life cannot be proven objectively, they must be lived subjectively. To find your own truth is not to invent it or to believe whatever you want, but to passionately commit yourself to something greater, most profoundly to God. In the end, Kierkegaard's philosophy is a call to live authentically, to confront despair and anxiety head-on, and to take the leap of faith. He reminds us that life is not about blending into the crowd, but about standing as an individual before God, embracing the absurd, and living out our deepest truth with passion. His ideas on faith, anxiety, despair, and individuality continue to inspire existentialist thinkers, theologians, and everyday seekers of meaning even today. Kierkegaard did not leave us with a system to follow, he left us with a challenge, to confront ourselves, to embrace the absurd, and to become, in his words, a true self.